Oh, I got it. Here we go. Good afternoon. Welcome to Grand Rounds. Today we're delighted to introduce Anupam Jena. He is currently the Ruth L. Newhouse Associate Professor of Healthcare Policy at Harvard and does his clinical work at the MGH. He has his BA and MS degree at MIT, graduating Phi Beta Kappa, did a PhD at the University of Chicago in economics, and then did his medical school training there. Went back to MGH to do his residency. He's got well over 100 scientific publications, and when you read his CV, the impressive thing that I came away with is he's a very, very clever researcher. Some of the things that he studied, titles of his papers: Reduction in Firearm Injuries during NRA Annual Conventions. Very clever. Or how about acute myocardial infarction mortality during the dates of National Interventional Cardiology meetings? You got to hand it to him. It's very thoughtful, clever approach to bringing medical knowledge forward. He's a member of the IOM Committee for the Study of Diagnostic Errors in Healthcare. He has a number of publications that deal with gender-related issues, and today he's going to talk to us about gender differences in promotion, compensation, and patient outcomes. Thanks for coming.
Can you hear me okay? Oh, okay. Sounds like this works. So I'm actually going to talk from down here if that's okay. So a quick thing about my background. I have a PhD in economics. I trained at the University of Chicago. I spend most of my time doing health economics and health policy work. I work clinically at Mass General. I'm there about 4 weeks out of the year on the general medicine service. But I spend most of my time doing research and teach undergrad classes and med school classes on healthcare quality and healthcare policy. But most of the way I think about issues comes from my economics training. And so a lot of the work I do is very Freakonomics-like in nature. And before I start talking about these issues here, I'll kind of give you an overview of the types of projects that I work on. And then I'll also say the following. I would really like this to be an interactive talk. I realize the audience is a little bit bigger than might be ideal for that. But what I want to do is kind of help you think through how I think through these questions, which is from the lens of someone who works with a lot of data, with the lens of someone who thinks like an economist. And at the end, I want you to think that at the end, you could be doing this as well. There's nothing special about the work that I do. A lot of this thoughts, a lot of these thinkings, and the way we think is embedded with all of you. And I hope to get that out of you and do that in an interactive way. So if you don't answer questions, it'll be a little bit awkward. So help me out. So first, I want to start with financial disclosures. These are completely unrelated to what I'm going to talk about today, but I do work on pharmaceutical issues, but again, I'm not going to be talking about that today. Learning objectives, understand new big data approaches to studying gender differences in physician promotion and compensation, and then more broadly to understand how natural experiments, I'll describe what those are in a few minutes, can be used to study gender differences in patient outcomes, cost of care, quality of care, and just more broadly, other issues in medicine. So as far as examples of work, we just heard about this actually. So here's a couple of study ideas that we had in the last couple of years. So what happens to patients who are hospitalized when cardiologists go out of town to their major conventions like the American Heart Association and American College of Cardiology? So I'm going to do a poll, and please raise your hand one or the other. Who says that mortality for patients who have cardiac arrest goes up? If a patient happens to have a cardiac arrest the date of the ACC or AHA meetings, raise your hand if you think the mortality rate is higher. Okay, because staffing might be less, the types of cardiologists who go may be more experienced. You can make that argument. How about lower? All right, so, okay. So maybe you heard about this on Freakonomics. But so we basically find that, so for someone who has a cardiac arrest in Medicare and makes it to the hospital, the chance of dying within 30 days is about 70%. It's just like you don't want to have this condition. It's not a good thing to have. But if you come to the hospital on the date of the ACC or AHA meetings, same condition, your mortality rate is about 60%. So that's a 10 percentage point reduction. To give you some sense of the magnitude, that reduction is larger in size than most other interventions that are available cardiovascularly in general. So that tells you something about how doctors put together evidence to make decisions, and that kind of bundling of knowledge is critical for patient outcomes. Does the stress of politics kill? I'm not going to make any political statements here, but so the idea is the following, is that if you look at photos of President Obama or Clinton over their 8 years in office, they grade considerably. And the question comes up is, does being a world leader lead to accelerated aging? Now, it's a hard question to study because if you look at world leaders, or if you look at presidents, they live longer than the general population. And it's not surprising, right? Because they're more educated, different socioeconomic status, access to health care is just completely different. So how might you look at this question of whether or not being a world leader or having the stress of being a world leader leads to premature mortality? Well, one idea is to look at people who run in elections and compare them to people who win versus lose. So if we look at, let's say, 200 years worth of data, look at world leaders across 15 different countries, what do you find? What you find is that those elected to office, whether it be prime minister or president or chancellor, the life expectancy is about 3 years less than the runners-up in those elections who weren't elected to office. So I'm going to stop there. I'm not going to make any projections about the current state of affairs. And the last one is actually pretty timely because apparently the NRA convention is happening pretty soon in Dallas, Texas. So we had this idea of looking at what happens to gun injuries during rates of NRA annual conventions. And the idea was that these conventions are quite large. They attract 80 to 100,000 people a year. Venues may close because gun owners may not be in town. And so you might expect that, you might guess that there might be a reduction. But what we find actually, there's about a 10 to 15% reduction in gun injuries during the dates of these conventions annually. And the effects are largest when the convention is held in your state in a given year. So you're more likely to attend it and you're less likely to be using firearms during that period. So all of this is to say is that I have broad research interests in that I would not consider myself to be an expert in any one of these topics, including gender differences in promotion, in compensation. But these are areas that I've been thinking about in the last couple of years simply because they have a lot of overlap with what economists think about it, kind of the economics of the labor market and bias and discrimination, as well as the utilization of kind of interesting data sets that really haven't been brought to bear on these issues. So that's kind of the spiel. So I hope you got a sense of the way I kind of think through problems. I like problems that are of general interest, that are a little bit quirky, that rely on some sort of natural experiment in the sense that patients don't choose to have a cardiac arrest when they go to the hospital, or they don't know what the dates of the ACC or AHA meetings are. It's just kind of random. And so I try to use these sorts of natural experiments to tell us something about what works or doesn't work in healthcare, or just to answer broader questions in healthcare. So this is the first question I'd like to pose to you. We're now going to talk about gender issues for the rest of the talk. How would you study whether rates of promotion differ between male and female physicians in academic medicine? So that's the question that I had for you from a research perspective. Like, how would you start to study this? So just raise your hand. Like, what would you do? Would you do a survey? What would you do? Anybody? Oh, okay, good. You've got to warm up the crowd. Okay, what's your name? Okay, nice to meet you.
So you look at the MDs that graduate in the same year, male versus female.
And where would you get information on promotion? Would you do a survey, or how would you get information?
From the Department of Medicine, people who graduated 20 years ago, where they are, 10 years ago, where they are.
Good. So you could look at, for example, graduates of a residency program and follow them out and say, what are the differences in rates of promotion for graduates from this residency program? You might look at your own department and say, okay, let's look at differences in rates of promotion within our faculty. Now, what is the limitation of that kind of analysis? Underpowered. It might be underpowered, right? It might be underpowered. It might be costly to do. Can you really easily do this every year? Can you factor in all the things that might go into a promotion decision besides, what your clinical volume is? Like, what's your degree of specialization? What's your academic reputation, both locally, regionally, nationally? How many publications do you have? All these things you'd want to factor in. So if you did this in a survey-based way, you're limited in certain respects. And prior to the study that I'm going to describe, that's kind of what the literature looked like. And I should say it's an important literature. It's a long-standing literature. And by and large, it finds the same thing almost all the time, which is that there are gender differences in promotion. Once you start to account, even once you start to account for various things that you think might explain why men and women are promoted at different ranks within academic medicine. So the first challenge, if you're trying to put together analysis, is might it be underpowered? Are you looking at only one institution? Or maybe you have 10 institutions that you're looking at. You still are only going to get a picture at those 10 institutions. It will be informative, but it's only those 10 institutions. Previous studies have looked at limited specialties. So, for example, if you show that there is a slower rate of promotion among females in pediatrics, does that tell you about what's going on in general surgery? Does that tell you what's going on in infectious disease? The answer is maybe, but not necessarily. And then the last thing is, when you're answering this kind of question, you have to realize the various biases that people come at when they look at this kind of data. And one that comes up all the time is, are we comparing like-to-like work? So if you observe in data that women are promoted more slowly than men in academic medicine, the first question you have to ask is, are we comparing like-to-like? So for example, we know that women are more likely to work part-time. We have to account for that. If we observe that there are fewer publications or less clinical trial funding, should we account for that? I would make an argument that you maybe don't want to account for that if bias actually channels its way into, having less opportunities for collaboration or less formal training to get grants. But either way, you might make a plausible argument for why you want to account for that. But there's a lot of factors that are difficult to kind of study if you have a limited survey scope. And so what we did was the following. How many of you know what Doximity is? Okay, most of you. And how many of you are on the Doximity platform? So Doximity you could think of as it's like the LinkedIn for medicine. Nowadays, about 70% of doctors, I think, are registered members. At the time we did the study I'm going to describe, it was about 20 to 25%. But Doximity still collects information on nearly all U.S. physicians, and it gets that information through partnerships with state medical societies, professional societies, hospitals. We have information on about 1 million physicians on things like where they trained, what is their sex, how many years of experience they have, where do they go to residency, medical school, what is their specialty. Doximity has also kind of taken that information and matched it to other databases. So we know information on how many publications a given physician has, first author, last author publications, whether or not they've had clinical trials that they've led that have been registered at clinicaltrials.gov, which is a repository for clinical trials, whether or not they've gotten NIH funding. Again, these are all things that can be queried in automated ways. You just have to have the kind of toolkit to be able to put this data together. And so what we did was we partnered with Doximity several years ago and kind of had in mind a series of projects that were going to look at how various physician characteristics like years of experience relate to patient outcomes. But before we started that, one of the things that struck me when I was looking at this data was that we actually also had data on almost all U.S. medical faculty and their rank at the institution at the time we did the study, which was about 2014, 2015. And so the question that we asked was, well, one that other people have asked is, what are differences between men and women in rates of promotion? Once you start to account for things that we think are the central currency in academic medicine. So what is your specialty? How many years of experience do you have? What medical school, what residency program did you train at? What fellowship did you train at? How many NIH grants do you have? Have you led a clinical trial? How many publications do you have? And what you would think is after you start to account for these things, there's very little that's left on the table. You could make arguments about administrative positions or other leadership positions that we can't account for. But for the most part, I think that list right there captures a lot of what I would think is influential for determining salary. By the way, just stop me if you have any questions. In economics workshops, people usually start asking questions at the first slide, and it gets very personal very fast, and people are throwing cell phones at you at the end, and vice versa. So stop me if you have any questions. So this is data from a study that we published in JAMA, which was using Doximity data. And we didn't do any linkages at this point. We just looked at differences in rates of promotion across a bunch of different specialties once you account for these factors that I just outlined. And the summary is the following, is that there are differences across nearly all specialties except for a few. Radiology, I'll point out, is one where we do not observe women to be less likely to be promoted than men to the rank of full professor, or from the rank of assistant moving up to associate professor. My wife is a radiologist, so that's good for her, and I guess implicitly it's good for me. But what you can see from here, from the right column, is here the kind of the percentage point differences in the rates of promotion. So a few things to note here. First is that if you just look at the raw, unadjusted data, what you find is that the promotion gap between men and women is larger than what it will be as you start to account for various things that differ between men and women, so, clinical trial leadership, publications, et cetera. And so that's a kind of a point that's important to recognize. So there are differences in the types of work that's being done. But once you start to account for that, and you're comparing like to like, you're doing apples to apples comparisons, you still see that there are relatively large differences in promotion. Now, if you ask me, why did this paper end up in JAMA, what is special about it? It's not that we are saying something that is new here. Like, this is well recognized. But what I think the contribution here was to say, look, there is all this data that already exists out there that would allow us to drill down and say, what are the problems in specific specialties? What are the problems in specific hospitals? What are the problems for specific specialties in specific hospitals? And you don't have to do a large survey to do this every year that costs, $50,000 and takes 6 months to complete. This can be done at your fingertips. And you can do this every year. So you can assess how gender differences in promotion are trending over time in specialties and institutions every year. If you institute programs to try to improve things, as I know is going on here, you can measure directly what are the effects of those interventions and get a sense of whether or not the intended interventions are having their intended purpose. So I think that is the contribution of looking at this issue in a sort of a big data way. Let me pause for any questions on this. Okay, so it'll start to get a little bit more interactive soon. So how would you study whether salaries of male and female physicians differ? Oh yeah, do you have a question or answer?
No.
Or both?
I was going to go back and make a comment.
Please, yeah.
I was wondering, how do you interpret the data where we're saying, like, if you look at some of the ones that have smaller ends, so radiology, it still looks like a bad number in terms of promotion for women. It's sort of the confidence interval barely crosses 0, so technically that's the same. But when you got all that other data that points in the same direction, you have no reason to believe that the data would be different for radiology. Can you really say that they're doing better than anybody else?
Yeah, so there's kind of a statistical underpinning to that question, which is the following, is that when I say that there's no effect, what you really want to discern is there's no statistically significant effect, or how confidently can we say that? So you want to look at the confidence intervals around these estimates. So for example, radiology, women are about 2 percentage points less likely to be promoted to the rank of full professor compared to men, and the range is between -4 to 0.4. I would say that's probably a relatively narrow range. If it was -15 to +15, you would say it's underpowered. You only have data on 250 radiologists. Here we have 3,500 radiologists. These are all radiologists practicing in academic medical centers who have a faculty appointment. In the next study I'll describe, that becomes more of an issue because we look at a subset of institutions. In the back, yeah. Yeah, so we didn't break this up. So we broke it up regionally into census regions, and you see the same pattern across regions. In the next study I described, we actually tried to drill down into specific medical schools to see where the problem was better or worse, and we could identify places where it seems like they're doing a good job and places where they seem to not be doing as good a job. Yes? Yeah.
Some specialties, like pathology, have really old professors. So were years since medical school a big factor in the adjustment?
Yeah, it tends to be. It tends to be because a lot of compensation is just based on experience aside from other things like RVUs and things like that. So that is an issue. But again, this is something that we account for in these types of analyses, and we can do that because we have the data on, again, years of experience and other physician characteristics that might correlate with the age of the physician or with the gender of the physician. All right. So how would you study whether salaries of male and female physicians differ? So I'm asking you, like, how would you study this? Don't be shy. That was a kind of a lazy hint. It's almost like you're doing your hair, but okay. Yeah.
Well, this is amazing. So I was a medical student, so this is really pretty remarkable that I'm now attending this program. So I think one of the challenges of academic medicine is there's a lack of transparency when it comes to salaries. And one of the things that we've talked about on our committee to advance the promotion of women is, wouldn't it be great if we could just have a list of how much people get paid and as a state institution, because of the very fees.
So it turns out, I mean, that's the insight you have. So again, when I started, I said I'm not a gender equity and compensation and promotions researcher, but I do view things from the lens of a person who works with a lot of data. So one day I was looking at the salaries of economists at UCLA. And I was thinking, why are these salaries so much higher than the Harvard salaries? That's a separate issue. Different. I'm not bitter, no. And then I said, okay, well, what about the physicians at UCLA? Can we actually see what they make? And it turns out that you can. And it then turns out that at a number of medical schools, I think maybe even in UC, you can actually see the salaries of physicians as well as other state employees online. And this is remarkably underused by people. This is like a shock to many people, surprisingly. And so I then looked at my research and said, well, what can we do with this data? Because we have data on 100,000 physicians in U.S. medical schools. We can't possibly try to click on everybody's name and see who's at which institution and download their data. And he said, no, actually, you can scrape this information from the web. So that was my first introduction to web scraping. And it turns out that you can. So you can collect data on about 10,000 physicians who work at about 25 medical schools that are public medical schools where salary information is reported online. You can take that information and you can link it back to the Doximity data. You can also link it to data from Medicare. So Medicare is the largest insurer in this country. They have detailed information on how much each physician is billing Medicare for various services. This obviously wouldn't apply to pediatrics, but for most other specialties, this is a relevant consideration. And so you can even start to get a sense of what is the clinical practice volume of individual doctors, because that might matter as well. So men might be getting paid more because they see more patients or they do more procedures. Well, to the extent that Medicare proxies for what's the overall kind of style of care or practice patterns of a physician, we can account for that. And so what we did basically was we collected data from about 24 medical schools over across, I believe, 12 states where this information is publicly available and downloadable. And we linked it to Doximity to study differences, sex differences in salary across these institutions. Now, this is an even harder question to study than looking at promotions. And why is that? Because promotion information, if you really had a lot of effort, you made a lot of effort, you could find this information online. Salaries, prior to this, it's an entirely different ballgame. What you'd be relying on is surveys of individuals asking them how much they make, and you don't know what they're including in those salaries and whether or not they're making, telling you their correct salary at all. And the people who have this information weren't doing these analyses, I mean, the institutions themselves. And so studying salaries is actually quite a difficult thing to do in medicine, academic medicine. But the kind of availability of these publicly mandated disclosures allowed for this opportunity. The other thing is, if you look at prior studies, they tend to focus either on single institutions where the data might be available, or they look at particular specialties, again, like pediatrics or pathology or something like that. But this gives you the opportunity to look at all specialties. It gives you the opportunity to look geographically at how there are differences or across particular institutions. And then the last point, which I made before, is it allows you to replicate analyses very quickly and very frequently. And the reason that's important is because if you are doing interventions in a hospital or a medical system or a medical school to try to improve gender differences in compensation, you want to get a sense of whether this is working. And if you know what different hospitals are doing in terms of various policies, you can see what seems to be working and what isn't working. And you can do this in a very kind of at-scale way, because pulling together the data is not that difficult once you have a platform to do so. And so what we did is essentially the same analysis that I described before. We basically just looked at differences between men and women in salaries in academic hospitals. These are public state universities. And the additional thing that we put in there was some measure of the clinical volume of these physicians, was proxied by Medicare payments. And what you see is the following, is if you just look at the raw data, the unadjusted data, there's a large difference between men and women at these institutions. So for male faculty, we're looking at about 6,600 physicians, $260,000 a year, approximately. Female faculty, about $205,000 a year. And the bottom graph just shows the histogram. And so the red bars reflect women. You can see they're shifted towards the left. So the whole mass of the distribution is shifted towards the left compared to males. Now, this is informative. It tells you what are the unadjusted differences. And again, these are important to look at. And the reason why is because you could make an argument that, well, you need to see whether or not there's differences in publications, grants, But again, if those things are if differences in rates of clinical trial leadership or publications are one way in which gender bias mediates its effects, it's not something that you want to, quote unquote, control for in your analysis. So whenever you're looking at these kinds of questions, you want to look at what are the unadjusted differences, meaning just the raw differences in averages salaries between men and women, as well as what happens when you start to account for a variety of factors. And so you can see there's a large difference just in unadjusted terms. Was there a question in the back? No? Okay. So this is a very busy table. But again, the point of this table is to say, if you look at individual specialties, you see that there are still large differences in salaries between men and women across all specialties. Now, going to your point about, is radiology different, or do we have small sample sizes? Oddly enough, radiology is a specialty where we seem to see the same kind of lack of an effect. Now, the confidence intervals here are quite a bit larger, so that reflects that the sample size is roughly a sixth of what it was in the other analysis. But what you can kind of do is see across these specialties what are the differences in compensation. So in percentage terms, this is about a 15% difference. So what I'm saying is the following. So if you take two people who have the same number of publications, first author and last author, same amount of clinical trials that they've led, same amount of NIH funding, same medical school, same fellowship, same residency, and we can kind of do this analysis. We're looking at a fair amount of data, so we can kind of say, well, when you look within these groups, these are two groups of people who are pretty similar. But if we're looking at men, we're talking about a 15% higher salary on average compared to women. And this is using data from about 2015. So you can only imagine what the difference might have been prior to this time period when these issues were being less actively discussed. Now, I think that this, again, people have looked at gender differences in salary. There are fewer studies of that issue because it's harder to get salary data. But what we're showing here is not discordant from previous studies. But I think what's interesting here is the data that's being used and the insight that this data is already available and it's not being used. And it can be replicated, again, quickly and regularly to make sure that whatever interventions you're doing to try to improve things are actually working as they're intended to be. Any questions? Yes, please. Well,
Can I just say this is broadcast, so if you don't mind repeating questions and comments.
Oh, yes, okay. Yeah, thank you.
Other
Yeah,
sides
thanks,
can hear it. Thank you.
So I have a question about how your data may change behavior and the data itself over time. So And I'll give you an example. So in our institution, over the last few years, adjusting salary towards national benchmarks has become the norm, or at least within our department. So functionally what happens is people who are above, let's say, a 50th percentile don't get adjusted. People who are below that get adjusted to the mean, and we're looking at a national mean. So if that becomes a common behavior, what will that do with the data over time? And so one is, I presume that you'd start to see regression to the mean between men and women, but would that cause an overall inflationary effect on salaries over time?
I mean, I think if the policy is to say to bring everybody towards a mean, I don't know what effect would have here, because what we're trying to do here is say it's not the case that everybody should be getting paid the same. It is the case that everybody who's doing similar work should be getting paid the same. And so to the extent that those policies are kind of ad hoc and they say, well, you're getting paid less than the median or the mean, we're going to bring you up, and someone else we're going to bring down, that may actually have the opposite effect of what's intended. So it's hard to know. But I think in general, as this information becomes more widely used, I would expect things to get better. Now, in fact, what we wanted to see, we haven't been able to do this yet, is look at what happens at these institutions when these data go public. So you might think that prior to this information being publicly available, men and women aren't, they're not aware of the salaries of each other, and so they don't negotiate more. But now this information is available, you can look online and see what's happening. Maybe we would see some differences. And I apologize, I actually forgot to repeat the question, so I will repeat the next question. Yeah.
Do you think that because the data set that you actually used were institutions where you could scrape that from the internet, that if anything, because some of us do know about the ones where you can search, and for CU, there are ways you can see what salaries in different groups are, not by name, but so. And at Free University of Texas, you can literally look up people by name. You can put a faculty member's name in. And so I've always, do you think, if anything, you're underestimating it because you're actually looking at institutions where you could actually scrape the data, where there's many more institutions where it would be much harder to find out?
So what Dr. Mathai asked, and I'll tell you, first of all, we were co-residents together at MGH. What she asked was, do we think that these estimates are they're biased downwards? I mean, the true effect is larger because they're reflective institutions that made this information public. And in places where this information wasn't public, would we expect larger differences? I think it's quite possible that you might. I was going to say Susan, but then it reminds me of another study. Tell me if you've heard this story, but there was a study about a year or so ago that looked at how Grand Round speakers are introduced by the, I'll say introducer, but I realize that's if you're in the cath lab, that has a separate meaning. But by the person who's making the introduction, if the Grand Round speaker is a male, they're more likely to be referred to by Dr. So-and-so as opposed to the first name of the speaker, which is more likely to be used when the person's female. So this is an unconscious bias that creeps in.
Do you have any insight into why some of the fields like OBGYN and PEDS, which have been historically more female-dominated for a longer period of time at least, still have such a huge difference in salaries?
Yeah, so the question is why is it that specialties such as OBGYN and pediatrics, which have relatively more females, why we still observe differences? And I don't have any good insights into that. We've thought about that and don't have good answers. My wife has thought about why is radiology different. We don't have great answers. We've thought about taking these data and looking back at whether or not the chair of the department is a male or female to see whether or not that has any influence on these issues. Because you might think, again, I don't know if this is true, but you might think that there may be more attention on this issue if the chair is female. So that's something that we're kind of doing right now. Yes, please.
I was on the faculty at the University of Washington for 21 years before coming here, and they were paying, on average, about the 35th percentile of the AAMC benchmarks for every specialty. And every 3 or 4 years, the Seattle paper would list the top 25 state employees' salaries. Just out of interest, what do you think the number one person was? What job? Yeah, it was the football coach every year, and that was 3 or 4 times what number 2 was. Yeah. Number 2 was the chancellor of the university. I was on that list every year, or every time it came out, number 20, 25, something like that. And about 10% of our friends said, whoa, look how much he's making. The other 90% said, oh, look what he's making. You know?
Those are your friends in the private practice. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And Goldman Sachs, yeah.
But the point was that there wasn't a single neurosurgeon or electrophysiologist or pathologist on the list, because what they were reporting was the state component of the salary, not the total salary.
Yes.
And that could be a limiting factor in the data that that
so
you're
we try to look at institutions where that is not an issue, but this comes up at certain places where there's a state component. So the question was, when we're looking at salary data that's reported publicly online, how much are we really capturing the true salary if there's a state component versus a private hospital component? So we try to look at the places where that was not, where we didn't think that was an issue, and we did that just by calling different universities and seeing. Because there's many more state schools that have information online than what we analyzed.
I have one more question.
Oh, yes, please, yeah.
It's basically along the same lines as that. Given that the publicly reported salaries are going to be less than everything else, signing bonus and whatnot, did you run into, I'm sure you thought about this a lot. I'm curious to know what roadblocks you came across and what avenues you maybe pursued to look into that question more that you weren't able. You looked at the Medicare payment as one thing to adjust for, but I'm sure you thought of 20 other ways that ended up not panning out. I was just curious what other ways you took.
So I think there's 2 questions there. One is, how do we deal with the fact that the salaries may not be accurate? I think the way that we dealt with this is try to figure out those institutions where we thought the salary data was more accurate. And 2 is, inaccuracy isn't by itself a problem. It's inaccuracy that's systematically related to the sex of the physician that's a problem. So if we're measuring error at random between men and women, that actually is not a problem, because what we're getting is there's a 15% difference. That would be true whether or not there's an error or not. Approximately true. It could be downward biased, actually. The second question is, what other things would we have wanted to account for that we didn't? We had data on things like membership in the National Academy of Medicine, or other like professional specialty societies, like are you a fellow of the American College of Cardiology, things like that, like honors. So things that Doximity had, we also had information on, and that doesn't seem to change anything. But things at the local level or the institutional level, like how much time you spend on administrative duties, that kind of thing we wouldn't have. If we had information on, for example, whether or not someone's a residency program director or quality and safety officer, that might affect things, but we didn't have information on that. And so to the extent that there are differences between men and women in those things, the question is whether it be upward biasing or downward biasing our results. I think it'd probably be downward biasing our findings. All right, so this is, I think, where, for me at least, it starts to get, next few ideas is where it starts to get quite interesting. So how do outcomes of men, so who makes better doctors, men or women? This is a straw man. Raise your hand if you think. This is a trick question. I'm hoping no man raises their hand. Otherwise, we have separate session on marital counseling afterwards. So again, I remember I started out by saying that one of the initial reasons that we wanted to link Doximity data to data from Medicare, which is patient data and patient outcomes and cost of care, is we wanted to understand how various physician characteristics are associated with outcomes. So how do outcomes of a physician change with time? So we've shown that, at least in hospital-based care, mortality rates are higher as physicians are further from residency. We've looked at foreign medical graduates versus domestic medical graduates, and we found that within the same hospital, if your doctor trained at a foreign medical university, your outcomes are better. The mortality rate is lower. And there's reasons I'm happy to talk about after why that might be the case. Another question that came up, and it came up in part because we've been interested in these issues, is how do outcomes differ between male and female physicians? It's a difficult question to study for a lot of reasons. One is that male and female physicians differ in a lot of ways. So you're not just comparing XX versus XY. It's like there's a lot of things that are different between people, and we recognize that in this study that I'll talk about, we're not really talking about what we're trying to do is gain insights about what might cause differences in outcomes, but also to make a broader point about the quality of work that's being provided by male and female physicians. So let me ask you the first question. If you had data on all patients in Medicare, you could identify who the physician was who was most responsible for their care. You could determine whether that physician was a male or female. And let's say that you found that in the hospital setting, the mortality rates of patients treated by female physicians is lower than male physicians. What would you be worried about? What's the first threat to the validity of that finding?
Disease severity of illness.
Disease severity of illness. So the first thing that comes up is, are these patients different? That came up, by the way, in our study on cardiac outcomes during cardiology meetings. Are the patients who have a cardiac arrest during the dates of the ACC or AHA meetings healthier? It came up and we looked at what happens when the Joint Commission comes to U.S. hospitals, and we find that mortality rates fall when the Joint Commission comes. Is it because the patients who are being admitted to the hospital are systematically healthier? Turns out probably not. So how would we deal with this concern that patients who are treated by female physicians may be systematically healthier, and that is why they have lower mortality? Because that would be a very reasonable thing to say in the outpatient setting. I don't have any data to say that's true, but it would be a reasonable thing to think it would be an issue. Now, how could we mitigate that problem in a natural experiment sort of way? Any ideas? Are there particular settings where you might look at, in medicine in general, where you think that patients are pretty much randomized to the doctor that they have? What settings might that be? So that sounds almost like Harry Potter whispers here. So say it loud. So what are settings where you think that patients are maybe randomized to the doctor that treats them? The ER. Okay, so the ER would be a great place because no patient goes to the ER knowing that Timmy versus Sally is working in the ER that day. So patients are effectively randomized, and in other work where we've looked at how opioid prescribing patterns of ED doctors correlate with long-term use of these patients who are kind of essentially quasi-randomized to high versus low intensity prescribers, you can see from the data that the patients are effectively balanced between various doctors. It almost looks like a table one in a randomized controlled trial, and that's because patients don't choose their doctor. So the ER would be one setting. Other settings in the hospital, the inpatient setting? ICU. So ICU would be terrific because ICU docs will often work 1 or 2 week blocks and then someone else comes on, and the patients don't elect to go to the ICU depending on which doctor is in the hospital. The other place that is relevant would be in the hospital medicine setting, which is like hospitalists. So many hospitalists will work either shifts, night shifts, day shifts, or they'll work 1 week at a time and then be off for a week or 2 weeks at a time and so forth. And what you can see in the data is that patients who are treated by male and female hospitalists look almost identical on maybe 25 to 30 observable characteristics. So when you look at the data, it conforms to what you think might be going on, is that no doctor goes to the hospital thinking to themselves, no patient goes to the hospital thinking to themselves, I'm coming in with heart failure, is Tony or Lisa going to be my attending this week? They don't know who their inpatient doctor is, and it's effectively random. So we use that sort of quasi-random assignment to come up with this natural experiment where we can look and see how various physician characteristics relate to outcomes, whether it be the gender of the physician, the sex of the physician, the age or the experience of the physician, where they trained, medical school, foreign medical schools, whatever it may be. But this is kind of a nice workhorse to try to understand what might be the causal effect of being seen by one provider versus another. And this is a study that we published in JAMA Internal Medicine, I think about 1.5 years ago, which essentially looked in Medicare. So looked in Medicare, millions of patients who were treated by male versus female hospitalist physicians within the same hospital. So we look within the same hospital, is your primary attending a male or female? And we looked at 30-day mortality rates and readmissions after hospitalization. And the basic finding is that the mortality rate is about 0.5 percentage point lower. So in kind of relative terms, that's something like, let's say, 5 to 10%, somewhere in that range, depending on what specification you're using. But the 30-day mortality rate is lower for patients who who are treated by female physicians versus male physicians. Same is true for the readmissions rate. Now, if it's not related to patient characteristics, and it's not related to years of experience of the physician, which we can account for, or where they trained, which we can account for, or their practice volume, which we can account for, can you think of reasons why this might be true? Like, why might we observe this in a causal way? Females are better. Okay, all right. All right, I'll see you guys later. Okay. So, there's a variety of things you could think about. Like, do female physicians spend more time with patients and elicit more information that's relevant from the history? And that can then inform a better differential diagnosis and treatment plan? Possible. Could it be that female physicians on average differ slightly in terms of the way the differential is formed? So outside of healthcare, in the finance world, there's good evidence that male investors are more likely to prematurely close in on investments and less likely to kind of think broadly about whether or not this investment makes sense. It's an issue of maybe risk aversion. So could it be that there's premature closure or anchoring on diagnosis that differs between men and women? And the point of this is not to say that we should make all physicians in this country female, because that would be a challenge. And, I wouldn't want that to happen to myself. But it is to say, what can, are there kind of insights that we can glean from differential outcomes across physicians and patients who we think are really randomized to each other that might be informative? So one avenue that you could take is to say, all right, well, let's look at the notes. Let's use EHR data. Let's look at the notes of female physicians versus male physicians. Are those notes longer? Do they encompass a broader differential diagnosis? What are the things that we see that are different in a kind of large-scale data-based way? That's where I kind of see this kind of research potentially going. So let me pause for questions, and I have two more kind of examples to go through. So had you heard of this study before I presented it today? Okay. And, oh yeah, please, yeah.
I have a comment and a question. One thing is, several years ago there was a study that looked at self-assessments among medical students, and it basically showed that male medical students were more likely to rate themselves higher than their performance, and female medical students were actually more likely to rate themselves lower. What I found really interesting was the conclusion of the study was that female medical students need to be more confident. And as a faculty member, I will say that the residents that I worry about the most are not the ones that don't think they know more than they do. It's the ones that think they know when they don't.
Yeah.
And so I do wonder, in terms of when you're talking about what could account for these differences, if that's some objective data that you could look at. The other thing that maybe you can address at the end of your talk, I'm curious about, is when I saw this study, it was widely circulated on social media, and there was a lot of my female colleagues and friends saying, like, this is great, and there were a lot of people saying, look, female doctors are better than male doctors. And while I am all about gender equality, and I'm so glad you're doing this research, I do think we have to caution how we present this data, because you could ask yourself, is it inherently sexist to ask this question?
Yeah, so that's a terrific point. I think that maybe the way I'd summarize the question is first of all, like, what do you do with this information? Do we really take this information, and should we be saying that female doctors are better than male doctors? I think only if you're in a tongue-in-cheek way would you really say that. What I look at this data as reflecting is a couple of things. So one is, clearly the differences between men and women are much larger, are much smaller in magnitude than the differences that we would observe within men and within women. So this is not a story about females being better doctors than males. It's a story about trying to understand what might be the differences that generate these observed findings with relation to outcomes like mortality and readmissions. The other point that I would make is the following: is you don't see this so much, I think, in academic medicine, but this comes up a lot in the labor economics literature. And the question is, are there differences in the productivity of work between male and female physicians, males and females in the general labor market? And there's reasonable things that might explain that. And so part of the reason that I think this paper is important is because it pushes back against that idea. It pushes back against the idea that somehow there are differences between either the quality of care that's being provided or the investments that are being made. And again, that's not to say that female physicians are better than male physicians. It's kind of a joke to make everybody a female physician, but that's kind of the context behind the study. But I completely appreciate your point. I wasn't on Twitter at that time, but I can totally imagine now being on Twitter what kind of stuff was going around. All right, so a couple more things, and then I'll end with something a little bit different. So this is not my own work, but this is work of someone named Heather Sarsens, who's a PhD student at, she's just finishing her PhD at Harvard in the economics department. And she had a study which is, I think, one of the most interesting studies that I've seen on these issues. And it relates to how gender differences of gender differences how cause of medical error are attributed. So I want to give you a thought experiment. So all of you are involved in some capacity or have trained in internal medicine, I presume. Now think about the following situation. You're a primary care doctor. Just imagine you're a primary care doctor. You have a patient that you refer to surgery. Okay? That patient is treated by a male surgeon, or the surgery is performed by a male surgeon versus a female surgeon. Okay? And a day after the surgery, the patient who is treated by the male surgeon dies. And a day after the surgery, the patient who's treated by the female surgeon dies. Are you less likely to subsequently refer your patients to the female surgeon than to the male surgeon? Do you understand what I'm asking here? So what do you think people, primary care doctors, do you think that after an unexpected event like this, which is a death on the day of or the day after surgery, do you think primary care doctors would be less likely to refer subsequent patients to the female surgeon than to the male surgeon? Yeah. Turns out that that's true. So what Heather Sarsens did is she looked at data from Medicare, and she looked at primary care doctors who are taking care of these patients, and she looked at surgeons who are performing procedures. And in this data, you can see when a surgery is performed. You can see whether someone dies. And so you can kind of say, well, how does a doctor attribute an error? So what her basic finding is that after one of these unexpected events, which happens at kind of time zero, the referral rate to the female surgeon falls, which is the kind of the red dots, compared to the referral rate to the male surgeon. And the whole idea behind what she's showing is that when an error occurs, people are more likely, in this case doctors, we're not talking about people who are not versed in healthcare. In this case, doctors are more likely to attribute the adverse event to being a medical error related to the quality, potentially, of the surgeon, in the case of the female, as opposed to kind of like the cost of doing business. Medical errors happen, and Tony, I know he's a great surgeon, and this is really unfortunate. Mrs. Showalter, she was sick. I'm not surprised that she died. So this issue probably comes up quite a bit, and whether this is an explicit bias or an unconscious bias that's being practiced by primary care doctors, it's nonetheless a really interesting and revealing way to look at data that's already available to be studied and answer questions like this. All right, so the last thing I'm going to ask, and then I'll tell a personal story, is how would you study whether men and women promote themselves differently in academic medicine? So just throw out an idea. How would you study this? This comes up a lot. This comes up as an explanation for why women are less likely to be promoted and have lower salaries. There's just a difference in how men and women promote themselves. Any ideas? So you could look at salary negotiations. So if you had information on salary negotiations, you could see whether or not women negotiate less aggressive than men. All right, so just to focus your thinking, now I want to imagine that you are logging onto PubMed and you are pulling up an abstract. So visualize this abstract in your mind. Think about the author list and think about the text in the abstract. Does that give you any ideas for how you might study whether men and women promote themselves differently in life sciences? So visualize this abstract on PubMed. Any ideas? The tricky one. Say it louder.
What pronouns are used?
Yeah, what pronouns are used, like I or we, or what other terms might be used. So, for instance, when a article with a male first author and a male first author and a male last author, might they say something like the following: we identify a novel mechanism identifying, the linkage between these two genes using unique data, da-da-da, conclusions, this research is unprecedented, or something like that. Unique, novel, groundbreaking, these are the kinds of terms that you might imagine would be different. So it turns out, if you look at, this is about 3 million articles, we've now included about 2 million more articles. So if you look at data from PubMed and you attribute the sex of the first and last author, and look at the terms that are used. So if you look at papers published in the same journal, so papers published in the journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, same research area, published in the same year. They have the same number of citations. So these are papers that are equivalently important, we think, from a scientific perspective. So it's not that male authors are working on issues that are so much more important, they get cited more, and so they are permitted to use terms like groundbreaking. What you find is that women are about 10%, I call women teams, which is male, first, last author versus female, first and last author. They're about 10% less likely to use terms like that. So this is not smoking gun evidence of the question that I set out to you all, but it's just an interesting way to use data to try to reveal patterns about things that we think might be true, but is really hard to kind of show. Turns out that this effect is largest early in individuals' careers. So when this kind of gamesmanship and selling of yourself or promoting of yourself is largest early in your careers, and it has its biggest effect in the highest impact journals, where you would think that kind of promoting yourself or your work in this way would be most relevant. So the last thing I want to do is a little bit different. I hope you'll indulge me for about 2 minutes. We did some work recently which looked at males and females who are married to each other in academic medicine, and I found a couple things. So one is about 5 to 10% of male physicians are married to another female physician, and about 30% of female physicians are married to a male physician. So there's a big difference in who male doctors and female doctors marry. And that's relevant because a lot of what we talk about, and a lot of probably what's being done here at this institution and others, is thinking about the workplace. But you can also imagine that the home environment matters a lot for the ability for women in academic medicine to succeed. Other work that we've done using data that economists use to look at time, how time use occurs in the home, shows that on average about 100 to 150 minutes more on child care, household responsibilities among female physicians compared to their male counterparts. And this is even among physicians who are working the same amount of hours. So the home life really matters. And I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell it to you in a little bit different way. I apologize if it seems a little bit awkward, but I'll explain to you what I mean at the end. And it's a little bit hard for me to tell the story, but bear with me. So what does anybody know sign language? Good. So you won't know that I messed up. Yeah. So what I signed to is the following. This is the last thing I'll say, and I'm happy to take questions afterwards. I mentioned the story. I mentioned the discussion about the home life because it's really important in terms of understanding why we observe what we observe in academic medicine, and we don't really think about it. About 8 months ago, we had a second child, Aiden. Was born, he's now 8 months old, was born profoundly deaf in both ears. And my wife, who is a full-time radiologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital, has really been an amazing force in us learning sign language. And the reason that we're learning sign language is really two reasons. One is that one day, our hope is that by imbuing him with language, he will be able to sit in the same seats that you sit in today. And the second, is a recognition that if we weren't working together, there's no way that we could do this. And so it's natural to focus on how we can address these issues by looking at changes in the workplace. But as I said, 30% of female physicians are married to another male physician. And ask yourself how the home life looks, whether things are balanced, and if they're not, how important that might be. So I'll stop there, and thank you guys.
I just wondered, in the study where primary care physicians are referring to surgeons, did they break down the sex of the primary care physicians?
Yes, so they do. So the question is whether or not in the study which looked at differences in referral patterns to male and female surgeons after an unexpected event, whether or not they break down the analysis by the sex of the PCP. They do, and it's the same whether it's a male or female PCP.
Academic medicine represents only a small portion of medicine. Can this data be extrapolated to the rest of the medicine?
Repeat the question again?
Academic medicine is only a small portion of medicine.
Yeah.
All this data is from academic medicine. Can this be extrapolated to non-academic medicine?
So the data that I showed here today are all from academic medical centers. We have used data sets that the census produces for the purposes of understanding kind of broad demographic and labor market trends, and we see the same results, but we can't kind of control for all the various factors that we can do so here. So if you look at census data from the 1980s until 2016, female physicians earn about 15 to 20% less than male physicians, even if you account for various factors, but nothing nearly as rich in terms of detail as this. But you see the same pattern outside of academic medicine as well.
For coming and for a very interesting talk.